It's getting close to a full year since Splatoon 2's release date, and it's had plenty of updates including new maps, modes, and weapons, as well as clothing and a whole new single-player expansion charted for release in April, which adds the long-rumored playable Octolings. It's a quirky and utterly charming game that I feel only Nintendo could have made. The vibrant colors, lovable characters, and catchy music have a distinct Nintendo feel to them, but slightly different. There's a bit of an edge to it all, and I feel like it's a nice fit on the Mario company, especially after its decades of pandering to the youngest demographic that can hold a controller. The visuals are definitely on the childish side. You're not going to be finding Commander Shepard milling around Inkopolis Square, but the Inkling's sleek design and fashionable clothing is something all walks of life can find interest in. The Inklings themselves can be male or female, and each sex has their own selection of hairstyles to pick from. Maybe a short bob for the active lady Inkling, or how about sleeked over bangs with a ponytail for the dudelings out there. There's even an edgy buzz cut style for those edgelord boys out there, and creepy pigtails for the psychopaths. I can't be the only person out there who finds this haircut a little bit awkward, right? Aside from hair, you can change your pants and eye color, but the big proponent of self-expression is the gear you clad your Inkling in. There's hundreds of pieces of gear in the game, with even more coming in the future, and though some are just different colors of the same t-shirt, there's bound to be something in there for you. I personally try to theme myself after something each time I dress my squid, and that alone gives me a good 5 to 10 minutes of fun. With that said, I really enjoy seeing other people's costume creations during that hype-building battle intro, which is well made in and of itself. This intro that precedes every battle does an amazing job at getting you ready for another exciting bout. The stage you'll be inking is shown off, while slow beating drums coupled with long drawn-out strums and the wailing of synth primes you for the upcoming clash. This intro builds the tiniest bit of tension, which is broken by a whoosh that leads into one of the game's many battle themes. These songs that play while you duke it out range from the basic but effective rocking out tune that is the game's main theme, Incoming, to the musical chaos that is Broken Choral. These songs, though fairly different, are equally good at getting you into the swing of things and keep you motivated while battling it out. The previously mentioned Broken Choral does a great job of this for me. Its frantic pace and instrumentation is very different from other songs in the game, but the drums and bass do a good job at keeping the song rooted in the musical themes of Splatoon. There's more to the soundtrack though than blood-pumping ditties. The music in Salmon Run, the game's zombie horde mode, is full of industrial-sounding synths as well as the droning string instruments that, when put together, create a musical pressure that forms tension in the player. This is nice and works well with the frantic mess that is Salmon Run. There's also the single-player Octo Valley music, which is less chaotic than its multiplayer counterparts, and uses odd samples as well as funky effects to create a sound that I can only think to describe as malleable. If it isn't obvious at this point, I'm not really a music person, so I can only really describe how these songs make me feel, and if malleable is what the music makes me feel, I guess that's how I'll describe it. Regardless of the words I use to describe the music in Octo Valley, I find that it's very fitting for the single-player experience. It doesn't make the player feel pressured to move through its levels at a breakneck pace, but instead gently pushes you to continue with the songs. I would often find myself speeding up and slowing down depending on the music for that level, which is sometimes something easier said than done. The levels in single-player are fun, but also kind of boring for someone who's played as much multiplayer as I have. I've gone through about 80% of the game, and I've stopped because I just wasn't having fun. It could be a little satisfying breezing through levels, but I'd rather have something that pushes my knowledge of the game, or my dexterity at least, rather than just this weird in-between that Splatoon 2 single-player currently has. Hopefully the upcoming Octo expansion will solve some of that with its numerous levels and very exciting Octoling, though I doubt they'll change anything in terms of gameplay. But this all makes sense considering the team behind Splatoon wanted to make a multiplayer experience first and foremost, and they've done an amazing job with it. Each multiplayer game lasts only a few minutes, and it's rare that you'll be left wanting a match to end. In fact, I'd say quite the opposite. After every game I find myself craving more Splatoon, so I join in another game and continue this with a game after game after game. This is due to the fact that in most game modes, you're helping your team even when you're not intending to. Because of this, simply shooting is helpful regardless if it hits its mark or not. That means you don't have to be particularly skilled to feel like you're contributing. Even a bad player can make an opening for their more skilled teammates, and if you played Splatoon online, I'm sure you've already seen this. The new low-level player will just walk around shooting ink everywhere, and though they may only end up getting splatted, the ink they shoot is usable by anyone on their team, and thus is a tool for the other players. It's actually the game's focus on the ink mechanic that makes it so interesting to me. This single mechanic is fairly simple. You shoot ink, it falls, you can swim through your ink, and by doing so reload your ink canister. But you can't swim through your enemy's ink, and even walking on enemy ink makes you extremely slow. This means that your ink is a visual representation of where you can go, but your enemy can't. Though you don't gain any raw power from being on your own ink, simply being more mobile is a huge tool in this game, and having more space to move around in is a greater tool than doing more damage most of the time. But this also means that ink is your biggest weakness. Since swimming is so fast and the ink projectiles you shoot are generally slow, running away is a really powerful tool, but swimming is reliant on ink, and your paths are limited to what ink you have on the field. This means that the crazy speed you gain by swimming is balanced by a level of predictability, as well as an easy method of denying you that escape route. Sometimes in a conflict, the best idea is not to aim at your opponent, but to aim past them so you know they can't run away. You could even cut off an enemy ink trail to indirectly help out your teammates in a firefight. The ink by itself also creates a sort of line of scrimmage, where conflict can be found anywhere the two ink colors meet. It's this line of scrimmage that's super interesting, since the way the players interact with it changes depending on what weapons the players are using at that time. A good example of this is using a longer ranged weapon to not only attempt to take down the opponent, but also to back up your teammate by constantly assuring an escape route. It assures that the line of scrimmage isn't being pushed up towards you, while also attempting to take down the opponent and providing an escape route for your teammates. And it's this idea in relationship to the line of scrimmage that creates a lot of fun indirect interactions between the different weapon types. Chargers tend not to do a great job at taking turf, but they can play a long-range support by creating long strips of ink for teammates to swim up and down, or simply by taking out enemies from a great distance. But since chargers need a little bit of time to reach max strength, weapons that can more or less ignore this line of scrimmage, such as brushes, can usually get up before the charger has time to get them in their sights and splat them real quick. As of right now, there are 6 main categories of weapons, but I'd argue that there are more like 11 weapon types due to some major differences inside each category. Brushes and rollers are technically the same thing according to the game, but they have completely different functions and strengths. Rollers in Splatoon 2 are pretty slow, but they cover more ground and hit harder. They tend to be about grabbing turf and then fighting on it to grab more, while the speedy brush's whole goal is to rove around the map, splatting the unaware inkling and grabbing some annoying to recapture turf. The shooter category has the most variants, and it's a little surprising that they'd be classified as such. There are short-ranged weapons such as the Splattershot Jr., which are really easy to use and simple to understand. Then there's the Range Blaster, which fires very slowly and shoots a bubble which leaves a trail until it eventually pops. It's considerably harder to understand than the Splattershot Jr., and on top of that, it has a different projectile type, which, in my book, counts as a different weapon class altogether. My minor grievance with weapon classification aside, there's an absolute ton of weapon variants. Each weapon feels different even if they're quite literally the same weapon. This is due to the pre-designed sub and special weapons each primary weapon comes with. The Splattershot Jr. is the first weapon the game gives you, and it sports Splat Bombs, a basic grenade type sub-weapon, and Ink Armor, a team-wide ink shield. But by level 4 you unlock the custom Splattershot Jr., which functionally works exactly the same as the normal Splattershot Jr., but instead comes with the tracking auto bombs and the major minor nuisance Ink Storm. This change in the weapon set makes the Custom Jr. feel like a more aggressive flanker than a frontline fighter the base form feels like. At first I really hated the inability to mix and match my loadout, but I found myself falling in love with it after a good bit of thought, since it allows Nintendo to have more control over the balance of the game, as well as allowing them to introduce some new sub and super weapons in a nice small format before making dozens of weapons with them. The Bubble Blower is a good example of this. It's a super that has the potential of claiming a bunch of turf at once, but Nintendo was a little hesitant about unleashing it, so they released one weapon with it at first, the Forge Splattershot Pro. After seeing how people used it in the wild, they could better craft other sets to assure that they're fun and practical without feeling a little too strong. This brings up how great a job Nintendo has done with balancing the game as a whole. They took action when they felt something was too strong or too weak, and their attention to the details is something that impresses me so much. What doesn't impress me as much, though, is the map designs. Okay, that's a lie, but some of the maps are very complex, some are simple, and some are Moray Towers. Starfish Mainstage is currently my favorite map, and that's due to its simple but open design. There are 3 neutral conflict points, the main stage itself, and the 2 side routes on either side. It's really simple, but there are some sneaky things to take note of. Since the main stage has a huge projector screen above it, you can throw sprinklers on it to give you a consistent source of points and thus super meter. Or if you want the height advantage, you can go to either side of the stage and go to the large platforms which let you aim down the center stage, but give you a fairly big opening with the wall behind you being scalable. If you want to surprise your opponents, you could even use these side routes to sneak past the front line and flank them from behind. The map is also designed in a way to make pushing past the 2/3 mark really hard, since the enemy's spawn is guarded by a slope that you can't jump over. The only way to get there is to go all the way to the right, climb a small cube, and then walk down a small and narrow path that is easy to defend from. Well, I shouldn't say the only way. There are 1 or 2 other ways to get over there, but it is a lot harder and a lot easier to shoot you down when doing so. The whole map is really well constructed and has lots of opportunities for offense regardless of your playstyle, skill level, or current state of the map. But not all maps are created equal, and the worst offender is the previously mentioned Moray Towers. Moray Towers is a mess. Normally I'd like more vertical levels, but this one goes against everything Splatoon does right. The 2 spawns in Moray Towers are really high up on 2 mirrored towers, and the center conflict area is way down in the middle below both spawns. Since Inklings can climb walls by swimming up ink, that means there are a few routes to push into the enemy's territory by swimming up walls. The issue that this creates, though, is that all these forms of attack stem from a bottleneck. This means that when one team wins the conflict in the center, they'll start pushing up into the opponent's tower, creating several annoying ink trails that you have to go out of your way to cover up. Since these trails are so out of the way, it takes several precious seconds to return to the main conflict. This then creates a very annoying and unwanted downtime, which at least I personally would rather spend pushing the enemy's base. This is even worse when you have to consider that while you're covering up the enemy ink, your team is down a man on the front lines, allowing the enemy a better opportunity to do this again. Now I know what you might be thinking, well this is only for Turf War, the other modes are much more fun on that map. And I'd say that's generally true, if it wasn't for the painfully long return times. Since the towers are so far up, you'll spend a good amount of time just falling, landing, and then falling one more time until you're actually in the battle again. It's only a few seconds, and you could view that as the punishment for dying, but sometimes in some game modes it's hard to avoid dying. But on top of that, while you're falling, you can't even cover turf to get yourself some free points. You could take the grounded route, but by doing so, you're eating up time on the battlefield, and you're covering turf that no one really needs. It's just frustrating. And these platforms over here rarely even matter since the objectives for each game mode only spawn as far as this platform. I don't understand this map's inclusion, and whenever I see it come up, I have to think to myself, do I really want to play on Moray Towers? The answer is almost always no, and I move on to doing something else. Aside from Moray Towers, the rest of the stages are pretty well made and each have fun tricks to learn and exploit, as well as some interesting stage dynamics due to elevation, distance from spawn, and other factors. I mentioned a few times the game modes that are in Splatoon 2, but I realize I haven't actually talked about them yet, so let's do just that. The first and most basic game mode is Turf Wars, which is a simple mode where the 2 teams battle over who can cover the most turf by the end of 3 minutes. It's the first game mode that you'll be able to play in Splatoon, and it's the only game mode you'll be able to play until you hit level 10. Since the focus is on just covering ground, it's an excellent intro to the game as a whole. Much like Deathmatch and other games, it's a fun mess with little stakes, but is even easier since the simple act of shooting at any time is contributing to the goal at large. You can get splatted 10 times but still win because the other team neglected a few spots of turf, or splat no one and win by a landslide because you're just covering up turf. This plays in and enforces the simple satisfaction one gets by just fully covering the ground in their color, which is super important since it is a key mechanic of the game and will help you no matter what game mode you're playing. Next up is the first ranked battle mode, Splat Zones. Splat Zones is a simple King of the Hill type game mode where each team fights to hold the majority of a specific square or squares of turf. Whenever the team gets hold of a Splat Zone, a timer starts ticking down, and whichever team's counter hits 0 first wins. This is a nice evolution of Turf Wars since it's all about covering turf to win, but now you have to hold the majority of a small area and it changes its focus on pure offense and turf grabbing to attacking and defending. It's probably my favorite ranked game mode right now simply because I like grabbing turf and holding on to it, but the other three are still really fun in their own rights. Tower control is all about standing on a tower and moving it to the score zone. It's a tug-of-war game mode where simply being on the point is helping the team, but you're far more likely to get splatted while on it. Much like Splat Zones, it too has shifting attacking and defending playstyles, but when attacking, your pace is set by the speed of the tower, so it allows Nintendo to control how fast a team can win. Unlike the steady offense of tower control, Rainmaker can be an absolute stomping. It's not unusual for a game of Rainmaker to end in only a few seconds, but when it lasts longer than a minute, it can be some of the most intense back and forth the game has to offer. Rainmaker is a sort of capture the flag mode. Your goal is to grab the Rainmaker and then run it to the pedestal next to your enemy spawn. But when you pick up the Rainmaker, you're slower and you lose your primary, secondary, and super weapons. In exchange, you get the Rainmaker, which works kind of like a super version of the Charger. You have to charge it to shoot, but when you release it, it shoots forwards and then explodes on contact with terrain or enemy. The best means of moving with the Rainmaker is swimming, as is in any other situation, but since your shots are now considerably slower, there is a much bigger reliance on your teammates, making it the most teamwork-heavy game mode so far. Lastly, there's the newest game mode, Clam Blitz, which is all about collecting clams and breaking the enemy's shield around the basket, then dunking them in for some sweet points. Sadly, though, that's all I can really say. I haven't been able to play this mode yet, and that's due to a very specific problem Splatoon has created. To make sure their player base isn't split too thinly amongst several different game modes, Nintendo implemented a map and game mode rotating system. It's a great idea and keeps the game feeling fresh, which is a huge thing for me personally, but it means people like me who will only play every so often will often miss out on the new content Nintendo keeps batting us over the head with. Since each level of play, regular, ranked, and league, changes game modes and maps every 2 hours, there'll be times where you're unable to play on whatever new content Nintendo has added, simply because your schedule doesn't match up with Nintendo's. Especially when there's a new game mode, since regular only changes maps, its game mode is always Turf Wars. This means that if you want to play on the new map Nintendo added, you're probably going to have to wait a long time unless you spend the entire day playing Splatoon just waiting for the map to come up. For me personally, I don't care about playing on the new maps as much as I do the new game modes, but if I did care about playing on them, I'd probably be a little more frustrated with the system altogether. But I find that this slight frustration is only slight, and any of the troublesome aspects are brushed away easily due to the already mentioned aesthetics and its fun community. Since Splatoon is a Nintendo game, they've restricted the amount of verbal interaction in the game by a large amount. There's no voice chat, you can't even use a global chat or anything like that. Instead, Nintendo implemented a Miiverse, and it allows players to talk to each other through little blurbs and pictures, which is obviously being used to maximum effect at current. It's this silly means of communication that makes Splatoon feel like a living city instead of a barren wasteland where the only player contact is random teammates and rivals. I love just jumping into the game and seeing what bizarre trends are making waves in the Splatoon 2 community. With all that said though, I feel like this is a good time to bring up my bigger complaints with matchmaking, and that's a big problem. Despite Nintendo wanting to foster a community, Nintendo also doesn't want players ganging up on other players, so when you join a friend's game in regular or ranked battles, you're not guaranteed a spot on that friend's team. This means that sometimes you'll end up playing against them instead of with them, and I don't feel like I need to explain how annoying that is. But, as a small counter-argument though, I do find that playing against my friends every once in a while is a lot more fun than I expected. It's funny having a close duel with another player, only to find out that the gasping noises my friend was making were because of me, and that it was them I was facing off against the entire time. But that's not the primary issue this game's matchmaking has. At current, if I want to play with my friend, they have to join a game first, and then I have to join on them. This means that I need to wait for their game to finish before I can even join their game. This is very annoying because I have spent hours waiting for my friends to be out of their game so then I can join them. And this was even worse before when we wanted to change gear a lot and we'd have to leave the game, then rejoin the game just to change gear. Thankfully, a little bit of that has been fixed, but there's still the large issue that I can't group up with my friends and then queue as a group. I don't even care at this point if I am on the same team as them, I just want to be in the same game as them from minute 1. Yes, the problem isn't there for league battles where you have to queue up with 2 or 4 players, but for me the issue is still there because I don't want to play league battles most of the time. I just kind of want to casually play turf wars or maybe even do a ranked battle here and there. All I can really do is just cross my fingers and hope that with the Octo patch they add some kind of squad system, so when my friend joins a game, I don't have to wait 3 minutes to then play with them. Aside from that though, the actual matchmaking, i.e. the process of finding players around the same skill level and then starting a game with them, works really well. Games start up really quickly, usually you only have to wait a few seconds until you get your next match, and if someone leaves during your ranked match, you're not going to get penalized for them leaving. The game actually negates all rank changes if someone leaves. Well, leaves early enough, that is. Splatoon 2 is an incredible game, and each time I return to it, I'm surprised how much enjoyment I get from these little squids. Its first game mode is an amazing introduction to the core concepts of the game, and without it, I don't think I'd be as in love with it as I am. The maps and weapons all have quirks and secrets that keep me thinking and keep me looking for new ways to utilize the same old weapons on the same old maps. And despite its very cutesy style and child-friendly presentation, Splatoon definitely has a little bit of something that anyone can enjoy, especially if you're burnt out on other shooters.